Hi everyone, welcome to Religions of Japan. Since we have a very short week to start with, I thought I'd use the opportunity to set up some basics, both about Japan, about the course, and about key religious traditions in Japan to get us started. So let's start by looking at Japan. I'm sure you've all seen a map of Japan before, but I think there are a couple things to think about here. First of all, Japan is an archipelago made up of about 4,000 islands. It is highly mountainous, as you can see from the topographical aspect of this map, right? Covered in mountains, which also means there's very little arable land or relatively little land that can be used for agriculture given the overall size of Japan. Can't really see it from the map, but I'm sure I don't need to tell you that Japan is known for its various natural disasters. This, of course, includes earthquakes and typhoons, but we might also think about some of the disasters that come from those sources, right? If we think about the triple disaster back in 2011, the tsunami led to the nuclear disaster, right? If we think even further back in history, because of all of the earthquakes, you don't have a lot of stone or brick buildings in Japan, right? You have primarily wood buildings, which are very susceptible to fire. And this propensity for disasters does indeed affect the Japanese outlook on religion, if you will. Also want to think about Japan in relation to the countries around it, right? Japan is particularly close to the Korean peninsula. You can see they're so close that even with relatively unsophisticated navigation and boats, it's still relatively easy to cross between them. And so it's from the Korean peninsula that a lot of culture from Korea as well as from the Asian continent, notably China, came into Japan. But you'll also see that Japan is really close to Russia, and that will become more important in later history and religious developments. So this course overall takes a historical approach to the study of Japanese religions, and thus we will be starting with the earliest known religious aspects of Japan. And because of that, I'm going to come back again and again to this particular periodization chart here. So you'll see on the left that you have the Japanese historical periods, and then on the right you have what is more or less these sort of global ideas of periodization, right? Ancient, classical, medieval, and so on. And so what I'll do is the following. I'll highlight where we are, and of course we will be starting with the prehistory shortly next week. And then as we go through, I'll move through highlighting, the relevant area and talking a little bit about what else is going on in these periods in addition to religious developments. I'll do the same thing when we reach the modern period. To get us started, I'd like to talk about some basic concepts in the key religions of Japan. These are all things that you'll be seeing again and again as we go through, so some ideas to look out for and to familiarize yourself with. It makes sense to start with Shinto because it is indeed often considered the indigenous religion of Japan. We'll be talking about how accurate that description is, but there's no denying it's an important tradition within Japan. So Shinto literally means the way of the gods, and those gods are kami, which is often translated as gods, sometimes as spirits, and there are good reasons for both of these. The kami is a very wide category. It can include the really important deities in key myths, which we'll be reading next week. It can include local deities, often sometimes deities affiliated with particular clans. Can be divinized human figures, particular people who were considered to really be godlike and then become kami. It can refer to individual mountains, trees, rocks, and stones, which are either considered kami in and of themselves or to sort of house the kami. And finally, kami can all be either benevolent or malevolent. They can either bestow blessings or curses. And again, if we think back to the landscape of Japan, this makes a lot of sense in a country that has key disasters, right? So if the kami are angry, they're not going to do good things. If they're happy, they will provide, and therefore human agency becomes important. Another key aspect of Shinto is that there's a clear differentiation between the sacred and the mundane, particularly in terms of space. And this is one reason that Shinto's key symbol, if you will, is the torii, the shrine gate that shows that you are entering sacred space, usually shrine grounds. And sort of with this comes a very clear distinction between purity and pollution. So key pollutants are blood and death, and they need to stay away from sacred spaces. And if you encounter them, you need to purify yourself. So purification rituals become really important in Shinto. Moving on to Buddhism, and I want to stress these are just some basic ideas of Buddhism to get us started. We'll talk about these in more details. We'll talk about other Buddhist ideas in great detail as well. These are just some of the key concepts. So Buddhism was founded in India and therefore does draw some concepts from Hinduism, notably karma and samsara. Karma is a term I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with because we use it so casually these days. It literally means action, but the connotation tends to be that it is the moral value of that action. Hence, we talk about good and bad karma. And depending on the, sort of overall value of your karma, you may end up in a different realm when you are reborn, right? There's this idea of samsara, or the cycle of rebirth, among multiple realms of existence. There are kind of 6 key realms in Buddhism. And so one of the key things that Buddhism teaches is that attachment and impermanence, the fact that we are attached to things and people, we have key desires, but even things we love particularly well are impermanent. This sort of struggle between attachment and impermanence leads to suffering. This is a very sort of short summary of the 4 Noble Truths, the Buddha's very first teaching. And so kind of going along with this, we remain trapped in samsara because of attachment and because we're sort of shrouded in mental illusions that we have to move beyond. And therefore Buddhism has a huge emphasis on training the mind, and the key techniques to do so are through meditation and study, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So again, sort of the things that are relied upon to help you escape the cycle of rebirth are the 3 jewels. The Buddha himself as a historical and religious figure, the Dharma, largely teachings coming from the Buddha, and the Sangha, the community, which could be just the monastic community, but could be the community of Buddhist believers at large. So the goal is, of course, enlightenment, right? Reaching these, sort of realizing these truths and achieving nirvana, which literally means non-existence, but it's, sort of escape from the cycle of samsara. Another key idea we'll see is called expedient means. That's the idea that the teachings can be sort of adjusted or phrased in different ways in order to help particular people, kind of understand it where they are. To help people in need who might struggle with some of the teachings, you can instead give them different teachings. And this is one reason we end up with so many different schools of Buddhism, as we'll certainly see in the case of Japan. And finally, another key concept is that of compassion for all sentient beings, which in Buddhism, sentient beings tends to refer to everyone from animals on upward, right? You show compassion towards others, and that helps you move beyond attachment and also makes the world a better place. I also want to talk about a couple of Chinese philosophies that appear in Japan and are very influential in their own way. So here you see 2 images, one of Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, and one of Zhuangzi, one of the early, sort of Taoist philosophers. And I think the pictures in and of themselves tell you all you need to know about these 2 traditions. Confucius is sitting, sort of very properly, looking very learned, whereas Zhuangzi is asleep and dreaming he's a butterfly. That sort of epitomizes these 2 traditions. Confucianism is known for its focus on social and moral order. One of the key reasons it's often called a philosophy and not a religion is because Confucianism really doesn't talk about gods. It doesn't necessarily worship Confucius. In some cases that can be said, but it's more about venerating him as a great example. And it doesn't really worry about the other world or what happens after death. The focus really is on ethics and, maintaining social order. So with this comes a lot of sort of key virtues, most notably loyalty and filial piety, but there's several others as well. And a key focus of Confucianism is hierarchical relationships. Confucius thought that the only way to maintain social order was for everyone to know their place. But one thing that he stressed, and that is often lost in brief descriptions of Confucianism, is that there are mutual obligations on both sides of these hierarchical relationships. For example, in the subject and ruler relationship, subjects somewhat obviously owe loyalty to the rulers, right? But the rulers also owe benevolence or ethical treatment to their subjects. So unethical rulers can be overthrown in a Confucian system because they're not fulfilling their end of the bargain. And this is indeed the justification for pretty much all dynastic overthrows in Chinese history. In the case of Taoism, it's very different. So it's called Taoism because of the Tao, which means the way. And but it's usually sort of described as life force that is indeed indescribable, inexplicable. You can't sort of pin it down, but it's everywhere. It sort of governs everything. And thus the focus is on spontaneity, going with the flow, as you will, sort of moving with the Tao and casting aside rules, which puts it definitely in stark contrast to Confucianism. But these two ideas really coexisted and still do to this day in China. There are some other philosophical systems that also came into Japan. I'll note a couple here, and again, we'll sort of see these crop up. Yin-yang theory is a key one that sometimes is affiliated with Taoism, but is sort of its own thing. Medicine that we call Chinese medicine, but it was really popular throughout East Asia. Geomancy, which feng shui is sort of an aspect of, ideas about how the world, the land, and forces within it work. These all came into Japan and exerted a great influence. And finally, a couple concepts I want to talk about and get us familiar with. One is religious pluralism, and this means the coexistence of multiple religious traditions within a particular society. We see this in Japan from very early on. Since the beginning of recorded history in Japan, we have multiple religious traditions that, coexist in relative harmony. Another thing we see in Japan, and especially as time goes on, is syncretism, the blending of elements from different religious traditions. We'll see this quite a lot with Shinto and Buddhism in particular, ways in which they borrow from each other or that people would practice both at the same time. So these are concepts I want you to, sort of keep in the back of your mind as we move through our discussion of religions of Japan. Finally, I wanted to take a moment to acquaint you with your textbook and sort of how readings are going to work. So the textbook is called Sources of Japanese Tradition. Do be sure you get volume 1 and not volume 2 or 2B. So this is the early Japanese history, really, from earliest times to 1600. We will, of course, talk about things after 1600, but this textbook will get us through the first about 5 weeks of class. So there is a limited access ebook on the library website, but it only allows one user at a time. So I do encourage those of you who can to access it in other ways. I will note it's very easy to find used copies of this textbook, and I will post PDFs for the first week if you want to order a used book that might take some time to get here. All other readings will be either links or PDFs on Canvas. And in addition to readings, I'll also be assigning videos each week. This course will focus on primary text. That's why we're working with a textbook called Sources of Japanese Tradition that has a lot of primary sources and introductory material. Also on material culture. So we'll be reading and looking at a lot of sort of primary objects in order to get a good sense of Japanese religions through the ages. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to meeting you on Friday.